My dad leaned into the microphone at the luxury gala and sneered, "Here comes the family beggar." He sneered into the microphone, and the room was quick to oblige his humor. My brother added coldly that he wished he'd never been my brother, while my mother looked away, like silence could still protect her. I didn't defend myself. I didn't move. I stood there carrying years of being dismissed. Then the CEO stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "before we continue, there's something you need to understand about her." The room went quiet, and that was when my family realized the story they'd believed was about to collapse. The laughter died in fragments. Some people caught themselves mid-breath, unsure whether to continue or retreat into polite confusion. I watched their faces shift, watched the way heads turned slowly toward the stage, then back to me, then to my father, who still held the microphone like a man who had not yet understood he was no longer in control of the narrative. The chandeliers above us seemed to dim, though I knew it was only my perception narrowing to the silence spreading through the ballroom. 300 guests, maybe more, all dressed in gowns and tailored suits, all suddenly aware that something had changed in the atmosphere. The clink of champagne glasses stopped. The murmur of conversation evaporated. What remained was a kind of collective holding of breath. I had felt this before. Not this exact moment, but the sensation beneath it. The familiar weight of being looked at without being seen. The instinct to shrink, to step back, to let the attention pass over me like weather. I had spent 32 years learning how to survive moments like this, though I had never expected one to arrive so publicly. My father's joke was not new. He had called me worse in the privacy of our home, in the casual cruelty of family dinners, in the offhand remarks that everyone pretended not to hear. The family beggar. It was his way of reducing me to something manageable, something that did not threaten his understanding of who mattered and who did not. I had grown up believing that label was mine to carry, that it was simply the truth of who I was in the hierarchy he had constructed. But standing there in that ballroom wearing a dress I had chosen for its simplicity rather than its cost, I realized that the label no longer fit. Not because I had changed, but because the world around me had finally caught up to who I had always been. My brother stood near the bar, his drink halfway to his lips, frozen in a posture of casual disdain that no longer matched the energy of the room. He had always been comfortable in his role as the favored son, the one whose failures were forgiven and whose successes were amplified. He did not know how to exist in a space where his position was uncertain. My mother remained where she had been all evening, slightly behind my father, slightly to the side, occupying the exact amount of space she had always allowed herself. She had a gift for disappearing into her own presence, for being there without being noticed, for avoiding the confrontations that might have protected me. I did not blame her anymore. I had stopped expecting her to choose me long ago. The CEO, a man named Richard Chen, who had built his reputation on precision and discretion, waited at the podium with the patience of someone who understood timing. He had not raised his voice. He had not demanded attention. He had simply spoken, and the room had responded. I knew what he was about to say. I had known for months that this moment might come, though I had never sought it. I had not planned for my family to be in this room when the truth emerged. I had not orchestrated a confrontation. I had simply lived my life, made my choices, built something that belonged to me. And tonight, by coincidence or fate, those parallel paths had finally crossed. Around me, I could see the subtle recalibrations happening in real time. A woman in emerald silk, who had ignored me earlier, now looked at me with renewed interest. A man who had asked my father about his golf game was now studying me with the careful attention of someone reassessing an investment. The social architecture of the room was shifting, and I was no longer standing in the foundation. What surprised me was how little I felt. I had imagined this moment in various forms over the years, fantasized about the day when my family would be forced to see me differently. I had expected satisfaction, vindication, perhaps even joy. Instead, there was only a strange calm, a recognition that this moment was not about revenge. It was about reality, finally aligning with truth. My father lowered the microphone slowly, his expression moving through confusion into something harder, something that looked almost like fear. He was a man who had always controlled the story of our family, who had decided who was worthy and who was not, who had built his identity on being the voice that others followed. He did not know how to exist in a story where he was not the author. The CEO cleared his throat. The room leaned in, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that everything that had come before this moment had been preparation. The years of silence, the accumulated dismissals, the slow and patient building of something outside their understanding. It had all led here to this ballroom, to this breath, before the revelation. I looked at Richard Chen, and something passed between us that required no words. He understood what this moment meant to me, and I understood what it meant to him to be the one delivering it. We had worked together for years, built something together, trusted each other through decisions that had shaped both our futures. He was not doing this for drama. He was doing this because it was true. The room waited. My family waited. And I waited too, though not for vindication. I waited for the moment when the story I had been told about myself would finally lose its power, when the words my father had used to define me would dissolve into irrelevance. Richard Chen began to speak again, and I let myself feel for the first time in years something that might have been hope. The moment stayed suspended in my mind long after the ballroom had emptied, but it was not the revelation itself that I kept returning to. It was the familiarity of what had come before it, the practiced ease with which my father had wielded his mockery, the way my brother had added his cold agreement without hesitation. They had not even needed to think about it. Dismissing me was as natural to them as breathing. I had spent my childhood learning to recognize the shape of my absence. Not a physical absence, for I was always present at the dinner table, always included in the family photographs that hung in the hallway of our Connecticut home. But there was another kind of absence, the kind that exists when people look through you instead of at you, when your voice is heard but not listened to, when your presence is acknowledged but not valued. My father never hurt me physically. He never raised his voice in genuine anger. His weapon was something more refined, more insidious. He used words the way other men used fists, delivering blows that left no visible marks but accumulated over years into something heavy and permanent. The family beggar, the afterthought, the one who would need to be carried. I remember the first time I understood that I occupied a different position than my brother. I was 8 years old, and Daniel was 12, and our father had taken us both to his office downtown. It was a Saturday, and the building was mostly empty, but he wanted to show us where he worked, to give us a sense of what he did and why it mattered. He walked Daniel through every room, explained every function, and introduced him to the few colleagues who were there. He talked about legacy and responsibility, about the importance of understanding how money moved and why. Daniel listened with the serious attention of a boy who understood he was being prepared for something. I followed behind them, unaddressed, unacknowledged. When we reached my father's corner office, he sat Daniel in his leather chair and took a photograph. I stood by the door waiting to be included. The photograph was later framed and placed on his desk. I was not in it. These were not dramatic moments of cruelty. They were small, almost imperceptible exclusions that accumulated into a pattern so consistent it became invisible to everyone except me. My father did not hate me. He simply did not consider me relevant to the story he was building, the story of a successful man passing his achievements to his son. My mother existed in the spaces between these moments, a presence that was always nearby, but never quite protective. She had her own way of surviving my father's household, a strategy of strategic invisibility that kept her safe from his sharper edges. She loved me. I believe in the way she was capable of loving, but she had made her choice long before I was old enough to understand it. She had chosen peace over justice, comfort over confrontation. When I did well in school, she would smile and tell me she was proud, but the words felt rehearsed, disconnected from any genuine engagement with my achievements. When I won the state math competition in 10th grade, she mentioned it at dinner as if reporting the weather. My father nodded without looking up from his plate. Daniel asked if there was any money involved, and when I said no, the conversation moved on. I learned to stop expecting recognition. More importantly, I learned to stop needing it. There is a kind of freedom that comes from accepting that the people who should celebrate you never will, a cold and lonely freedom, but freedom nonetheless. I began to build my sense of worth from different materials, from the quiet satisfaction of problems solved and challenges met, from the knowledge that my competence was real, even if it was unseen. Daniel, meanwhile, grew into exactly the role our father had designed for him. He was confident in the way that comes from never having been doubted, charming in the way that comes from always having been praised. His failures were treated as learning experiences, his mistakes as necessary steps in his development. When he crashed our father's car at 17, it became a funny story at family gatherings. When I got a B in chemistry the same year, my father asked if I was applying myself. The disparity was so consistent that it stopped feeling like injustice and started feeling like natural law. Daniel was the sun, and I was something that existed in his shadow, not by choice, but by the gravitational pull of my father's attention. I do not think Daniel was cruel by nature. He simply absorbed the hierarchy he was born into and never questioned whether it was fair. My mother's silence was the hardest part. She saw everything, understood everything, and chose to do nothing. She would sometimes catch my eye after one of my father's remarks, and I would see something there, a flicker of recognition, maybe even sympathy. But she never spoke up, never intervened, never pulled me aside to tell me that what was happening was wrong. I used to wonder if she was afraid of him. Later I understood that her silence was not about fear, but about calculation. She had weighed the cost of defending me against the cost of maintaining her position, and she had made her choice. I was not worth the disruption. By the time I left for college, I had already begun the process of building a separate life, a life where my value was not determined by my father's assessment. I chose economics, not because it was my passion, but because it was practical, because it gave me tools that could translate into independence. I worked while I studied, managed my own finances, made my own decisions, without seeking approval from people who had never offered it. I did not announce this separation. I did not declare my independence or confront anyone with their failures. I simply stopped participating in the fiction that I belonged to them in any meaningful way. I showed up for holidays because it was easier than explaining my absence, smiled through the dinners where Daniel's accomplishments were celebrated and mine were ignored, and then returned to the life I was building in the spaces they could not see. The role they gave me was the role of someone who did not matter. I accepted it for years because I did not know there was another option. But acceptance is not the same as belief, and somewhere beneath the surface of my compliance, I was already becoming someone else entirely. The decision came quietly, the way most important decisions do. There was no dramatic moment of realization, no confrontation that forced my hand. I simply woke up one morning during my junior year of college and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that I was done waiting to be seen by people who had no interest in looking. I was 20 years old, living in a small apartment near campus that I paid for with a combination of scholarships and part-time work. My roommate was a girl from Ohio who studied nursing and kept to herself, and we had developed a comfortable rhythm of coexistence that suited both of us. The apartment was nothing special, but it was mine, earned through my own efforts, uncontaminated by my family's opinions. That morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a spreadsheet open on my laptop, tracking my expenses and income for the month. I had been doing this since I was 18, not out of necessity, but out of a desire to understand where I stood, to know exactly what I had and what I needed. It was a habit that would serve me well in ways I could not yet imagine. I realized, looking at those numbers, that I had spent years orienting my life around a question that no longer mattered. The question has always been, how do I prove to them that I am worth something? But sitting there in that small kitchen, I understood that the question itself was flawed. I did not need to prove anything to anyone. I needed to build something for myself, something that existed independent of their approval or recognition. It was not a dramatic transformation. I did not suddenly become confident or fearless. I simply shifted my focus, redirected my energy from seeking validation to creating value. The difference was subtle but profound, like changing the angle of a lens and suddenly seeing a completely different picture. I chose finance because I was good at it, because numbers made sense to me in a way that human relationships often did not. There was a purity to mathematics, a reliability that I found comforting. Numbers did not lie, did not play favorites, did not pretend to see you while looking through you. They simply were what they were, and if you understood them well enough, they would tell you the truth. I studied relentlessly, not to impress anyone, but because I genuinely wanted to understand. I read textbooks and case studies, analyzed market trends, taught myself the fundamentals of investment analysis and risk assessment. My professors noticed my dedication, though I never sought their attention, and several of them began to mentor me informally, opening doors I had not known existed. My first internship was at a small investment firm in Hartford, the kind of place that did not recruit at prestigious schools, but took chances on students who showed promise. I was assigned to the research department, where my job was to compile data and generate reports that no one expected to be particularly good. But I took the work seriously, applied the same rigor I had developed in my studies, and within a few months my reports were being read by senior analysts who had initially ignored me. It was there that I learned the most important lesson of my early career competence, consistently demonstrated, eventually becomes impossible to ignore. I did not network aggressively or seek promotions. I simply did excellent work day after day and let the results speak for themselves. The firm offered me a full-time position after graduation, and I took it even though it meant staying in Hartford when my classmates were moving to New York or Boston for more prestigious opportunities. I understood something they did not. Prestige was borrowed power, something that could be given and taken away by others. What I wanted was owned power, the kind that came from building something myself. My family knew nothing of this. I had not told them about the internship, the job offer, the work I was doing. When they asked about my plans, I gave vague answers about exploring options, letting them assume whatever they wanted. My father probably assumed I was struggling. My mother probably assumed I would eventually come home and find something modest to occupy my time. Daniel probably did not think about me at all. I discovered my talent for speaking almost by accident. The firm needed someone to present our quarterly research to clients, and the senior analyst who usually handled it was sick. They asked me to fill in more out of desperation than confidence in my abilities, and I agreed because saying no had never been my strategy. I prepared, meticulously practiced, until I knew every word, every transition, every possible question. When I stood in front of those clients, something shifted. The nervousness I expected did not materialize. Instead, I felt a strange calm, a sense that I knew exactly what I was talking about and exactly how to communicate it. The years of silence in my family had taught me to choose my words carefully, to speak only when I had something worth saying. That discipline translated into a presence that people noticed. After the presentation, one of the clients approached me and asked how long I had been in the industry. When I told him in less than 2 years, he handed me his card and said to call him if I ever wanted to discuss opportunities. I did not call him immediately, but I kept the card, understanding that doors were beginning to open. Over the next few years, I moved through positions with deliberate purpose, each step chosen not for prestige, but for learning. I worked at a regional bank, then a consulting firm, then a startup that was trying to disrupt traditional investment models. Each role taught me something new, expanded my understanding of how money moved, and why people made the decisions they made. I began hosting financial seminars, small events at first, then larger ones as my reputation grew. I was not a charismatic speaker in the traditional sense, but I had something that audiences responded to: clarity. I could take complex concepts and make them understandable, could cut through jargon and confusion to deliver insights that people could actually use. My family remained oblivious. I attended holidays when I could not avoid them, smiled through dinners, where Daniel's latest venture was discussed in detail, and my life was glossed over in a few polite sentences. I no longer minded. Their ignorance was not a wound anymore. It was simply a fact, like the weather or the passage of time. I was building something they could not see in a world they did not understand, and for the first time in my life, I was genuinely happy. Daniel had always been the future our family was building toward. I understood this from an age too young to articulate it, absorbed it through the thousand small moments that communicated without words, whose dreams mattered and whose did not. He was 4 years older than me, which in childhood feels like a generation. By the time I was forming my earliest memories, He was already established as the center of our father's attention, the recipient of lessons and opportunities that I would only learn about secondhand. I do not remember resenting this arrangement at first. It simply was like gravity or the color of the sky, a fundamental feature of the world I had been born into. Our father was not a cruel man in the obvious ways. He provided for us, generously ensured we had good schools and comfortable lives, and showed up for the occasions that required his presence. But his attention was a finite resource, and he had allocated it entirely to Daniel, leaving nothing for me except the occasional glance of mild disappointment, as if my existence was a draft he had not quite gotten around to editing. Daniel absorbed this attention the way a plant absorbs sunlight growing toward it, shaping himself around it. He was not naturally brilliant, I would realize later, but he had been told so often that he was exceptional that he had come to believe it, and belief in certain circumstances can be a kind of truth. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously doubted, spoke with the authority of someone who expected to be listened to. Our father's plan for him was never stated explicitly, but was always understood. Daniel would learn the family business would take over when our father was ready to step back, and would carry the family name into the next generation with the success it deserved. Every conversation, every opportunity, every introduction was oriented toward this future. I watched from the periphery as Daniel was prepared for a life of significance. He was taken to board meetings while I was in elementary school, introduced to our father's colleagues as the next generation. His grades, which were mediocre at best, were explained away as the result of his being too creative for traditional academics. His failures were reframed as bold experiments, his mistakes as necessary education. When Daniel dropped out of his first semester of business school, our father called it a strategic pivot. When he spent 2 years traveling through Europe on our family's money, it was described as broadening his perspective. When he finally returned and announced he wanted to start his own company, our father provided the capital without hesitation, without due diligence, without the skepticism he would have applied to any other investment. The company was a tech startup of some kind, vague in its purpose and ambitious in its promises. Daniel talked about disruption and innovation using words he had learned from magazine articles and TED Talks, and our father nodded along as if he understood and approved. The business model never quite made sense to me, even from my distant vantage point, but I was not asked for my opinion and did not offer it. I had learned by then that my assessments were not welcome in family discussions. The few times I had offered observations about Daniel's ventures, I had been met with the kind of silence that communicates more than words. My father would look at me with something like pity, as if my concerns revealed my own limitations rather than any actual problems with Daniel's plans. My mother would change the subject. Daniel would smile the smile of someone who knows he is protected. So I stopped offering observations. I attended the family dinners where Daniel's progress was celebrated, listened to the optimistic reports that glossed over the warning signs, and kept my thoughts to myself. It was not my business, I told myself. It was not my money being risked. It was not my future being gambled on promises that grew more extravagant with each telling. But I watched. I could not help watching the way you cannot help watching a car that is slowly drifting toward the edge of the road. I saw the patterns that our father refused to see, the inconsistencies in Daniel's stories, the way his explanations became more elaborate as the actual results became more difficult to explain. The startup burned through its initial funding in 18 months. Daniel returned to our father for more, and more was provided. The second round lasted a year. The third round, which came with vague promises of imminent breakthrough, lasted 6 months before Daniel announced he was stepping back from day-to-day operations to focus on strategic vision. I understood what this meant, even if our parents did not. Daniel had built nothing proven, nothing learned, nothing except that his failures would always be cushioned by family money and family denial. He had been given every advantage and had squandered them all, not through bad luck, but through the fundamental lack of discipline that comes from never facing consequences. Our father continued to defend him, continued to explain away the failures, as the cost of innovation continued to believe in a future that grew more fictional with each passing year. I think he needed to believe it needed Daniel to succeed, because Daniel's success was his own success, his own validation, his own proof that his choices had been right. Watching this unfold taught me something valuable about the nature of privilege. It was not just about money or opportunity, though those mattered. It was about the stories people told themselves, the narratives they constructed to make sense of their choices. Our father had decided that Daniel was the future, and he would interpret every piece of evidence through that lens, no matter how much reality contradicted his conclusions. I was not part of that narrative. I existed outside it, looking in, seeing clearly what those inside could not see. And I understood with a certainty that settled into my bones that the stage being built for Daniel would not hold his weight forever. No one invited me to the opportunity that changed my trajectory. I found it myself, recognized it for what it was, and walked through the door before anyone could tell me I did not belong there. I was 28 years old, working at a mid-sized investment firm in Boston, doing work that was competent but not exceptional, building a reputation that was solid but not remarkable. I had been there for 3 years, long enough to understand the firm's patterns and limitations, long enough to see that advancement would be slow and dependent on factors beyond my control. The opportunity appeared in the form of a distressed asset portfolio that no one wanted to touch. A small regional bank was failing its loan book, a mess of bad decisions and worse timing, and our firm had been approached about potentially acquiring some of its holdings. The senior partners looked at the numbers and saw only risk, liability, and potential embarrassment. They passed, but I looked at the same numbers and saw something different. I saw patterns beneath the chaos, assets that had been mismanaged but were not worthless opportunities buried under layers of incompetence and neglect. I spent 3 weeks on my own time without telling anyone, analyzing the portfolio in detail, building models, identifying the pieces that could be salvaged and the pieces that should be abandoned. When I brought my analysis to my supervisor, he listened with the polite attention of someone who expected to be disappointed. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at my spreadsheets with an expression I could not read. He asked me if I was sure. I told him I was as sure as analysis could make me, which was not the same as certain, but was more than most decisions were built on. He asked me if I was willing to stake my reputation on this assessment. I told him I was. The firm made the acquisition following my recommendations almost exactly. I was given a small team and significant responsibility, more than I had ever held. The weight of it was immense, yet it settled onto my shoulders like something I had been waiting my whole life to carry. The next 18 months were the hardest and most exhilarating of my career. I worked constantly, not because anyone demanded it, but because the work demanded it, because every decision carried consequences, and I refused to make those decisions carelessly. I learned to manage people, to communicate clearly, to make choices under pressure, and defend those choices when they were questioned. The portfolio recovered. Not spectacularly, not in a way that made headlines, but steadily and reliably, each quarter a little better than the projections, each problem a little more manageable than expected. By the time we sold the last of the assets, the firm had made a substantial profit on an investment everyone else had rejected. I did not celebrate publicly. I did not seek credit or recognition. I simply noted the success, filed away the lessons I had learned, and began looking for the next opportunity. My reputation within the industry began to shift. I was no longer just competent. I was someone who saw what others missed, someone who could find value where others saw only risk. Invitations to conferences arrived, requests for interviews, offers from competitors who had heard about the distressed asset success. I began speaking at financial events, not as a performer, but as someone with genuine expertise to share. My style was not flashy, but it was effective. I spoke clearly, answered questions directly, and refused to hide behind jargon or complexity. Audiences responded to this, to the sense that I was telling them the truth rather than trying to impress them. One of those speeches led to a conversation that would change everything. Richard Chen was in the audience, a man I knew by reputation, but had never met. He was building something new, a financial institution that operated differently from the traditional banks and investment firms. After my talk, he approached me and asked if I had ever thought about being more than an employee. I told him I had thought about little else for years. He smiled, and we began to talk. The conversations continued over months, careful and deliberate, each of us assessing the other. Richard was not looking for someone to follow orders. He was looking for a partner, someone who could share the burden of building something from nothing. I was not looking for another job. I was looking for an opportunity to create something that belonged to me. We found in each other what we were looking for. Richard had vision and capital. I had analytical skills and operational discipline. Together, we began to build. My family knew nothing of this. I had long since stopped sharing my professional life with them, partly because they never asked, and partly because their indifference had become a kind of protection. They could not dismiss what they did not know about, could not diminish what they could not see. I was 30 years old when we incorporated the company that would eventually become the bank. I told no one except the people who needed to know. The foundation was being laid quietly and carefully for everything that would follow. There is a moment in every builder's journey when the safety of working for others becomes a prison rather than a protection. I reached that moment on an ordinary Tuesday, sitting in a conference room, listening to executives make decisions that contradicted everything my analysis told me, and I understood that I would never be free as long as I was implementing someone else's vision. Richard and I had been planning for months, but planning is not the same as doing. The gap between concept and execution is filled with fear, doubt, and the 1,000 practical obstacles that make most dreams die in the planning stage. I had seen that gap claim other people's ambitions, watched talented colleagues retreat to the safety of steady paychecks and predictable careers. I understood why they made that choice. The unknown is terrifying, and failure is not abstract when your livelihood depends on success. But I had already survived the worst thing I could imagine, which was being dismissed by the people who should have loved me most. Compared to that, business failure seemed almost manageable. At least if I failed to build something of my own, the failure would be mine, earned through my own choices, rather than imposed by someone else's limitations. We started small not because we lacked ambition, but because we respected reality. The financial services industry is heavily regulated, intensely competitive, and unforgiving of mistakes. We could not compete with established institutions on their terms, so we looked for spaces where traditional players were too large or too slow to operate effectively. We found our niche in small business lending, serving the entrepreneurs and shop owners who were too small for big banks to care about, but too legitimate for predatory lenders. It was not glamorous work, but it was necessary work, and necessity creates its own kind of value. I handled operations and risk assessment, while Richard managed relationships and capital. We complemented each other in ways that felt almost designed, filling each other's gaps, challenging each other's assumptions, building something that was stronger than either of us could have built alone. The early years were brutal. We made mistakes, some of them costly, and learned from each one. We lost clients we should have kept, and kept clients we should have lost. We hired people who disappointed us, and were disappointed by people we hired. The business nearly failed 3 times in the first 4 years, each crisis requiring us to make choices that felt impossible until we made them. But we survived. More than survived, we grew. Our reputation for fair dealing and sound judgment spread through the small business community, and referrals began to compound. Each success led to another opportunity. Each satisfied client led to another introduction. The foundation we had built with such care began to support a larger and larger structure. I did not attend family gatherings during this period, not out of resentment, but out of simple necessity. I did not have time for the performance of belonging, for the smiles and small talk that accomplished nothing. When my mother called to ask why I had missed Thanksgiving, I told her I was working. She did not ask what I was working on. This was fine. This was in fact exactly what I needed. Their continued indifference meant I could build without interference, grow without the weight of their opinions. They had written me off years ago, and their dismissal had become a gift, a freedom to become someone they would not recognize. The company grew. We expanded from small business lending into other services, each new offering built on the foundation of the one before. We developed technology that made our processes faster and more accurate, invested in people who shared our values, built a culture that attracted talent and retained it. By my 35th year, we were no longer small. We were not yet a major player in the industry, but we were significant enough to be noticed, successful enough to be studied. Financial publications began writing about us, asking how we had grown so quickly in a sector dominated by giants. I declined most interviews, preferring to let the work speak for itself. Richard insisted on one profile, arguing that visibility would help us attract better partners and more sophisticated clients. I agreed reluctantly, and the article that resulted was thorough and fair. It described our journey, our philosophy, our success. It mentioned me by name and described my role in building the company. I wondered, reading that article, whether anyone in my family would see it. I wondered if it would change anything if recognition from strangers could somehow translate into recognition from the people who had known me longest. But even as I wondered, I knew the answer. My family did not read financial publications. They did not follow industry news. They lived in a world where Daniel's continued failures were explained away and my absence was barely noticed. An article would not change that. Nothing would change that except direct confrontation, and direct confrontation was not what I wanted. What I wanted was simpler and more profound. I wanted to build something that would stand regardless of whether they ever acknowledged it. I wanted to prove not to them but to myself that their assessment of my worth had been wrong from the beginning. And standing in the office we had built, looking at the team we had assembled, knowing what we had created together, I understood that I had already succeeded. The invitation to the gala arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by courier to my office in a cream-colored envelope with embossed lettering. The annual Hartford Financial Summit was the kind of event I had attended many times over the years, sometimes as a speaker, sometimes as a sponsor, always as someone who belonged in the room. This year was different. This year, the invitation came with a request: would I be willing to be honored as one of the summit's distinguished leaders in innovation? The recognition came with responsibilities, including a prominent seat at the gala dinner and mentions in the evening's program. I agreed because refusing would have required explanations I did not want to give. The summit was important to our industry, and visibility at this level would benefit the company. My personal discomfort was irrelevant to those calculations. What I did not anticipate was the phone call from my mother 2 weeks later. My mother called my office directly, which was an unprecedented act of reaching out, and asked if I had heard about the Hartford Summit. I said I had. She said that my father had been invited as a guest of one of his business associates and the whole family was planning to attend. I felt the collision coming before she finished speaking. Two worlds that had existed separately for years were about to intersect, and there was nothing I could do to prevent it. My mother asked if I would be there too. I said I would. She said that was nice, that it would be good to see me, that perhaps we could all sit together. Her voice was pleasant and distant, the voice she used when she was performing Family rather than feeling it. I did not tell her about the honor. I did not explain my role in the evening's program. I simply agreed that it would be nice to see them and ended the call as quickly as politeness allowed. The weeks leading up to the gala were consumed with work, with preparations for the recognition and the responsibilities it entailed. I wrote remarks, approved programs, coordinated with the event organizers. Through it all, I was aware of the approaching collision, the moment when my family would walk into a room where I was not the person they believed me to be. I did not plan a confrontation. I did not strategize a revelation. I simply continued doing what I had always done, focusing on the work, trusting that the truth would emerge on its own timeline. Richard knew, of course. He had met my family once briefly at a conference several years earlier and had watched with quiet fascination as they talked around me and through me, never quite acknowledging my presence. He had asked about it afterward, and I had told him as much as I could articulate, which was not much, but was enough for him to understand. He asked if I wanted him to handle the situation, to manage the recognition in a way that minimized awkwardness. I told him no. Whatever happened at the gala would happen, and I would deal with it the way I had dealt with everything else in my relationship with my family, by surviving. The night of the gala, I dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that was professional and understated. I did not want to make a statement with my appearance. I wanted to let my presence speak for itself. I arrived early, as I always did for events where I had responsibilities. I greeted colleagues, spoke with organizers, and reviewed the evening's program one final time. The room filled gradually, elegantly dressed people circulating through a space designed to impress. My family arrived together, my father in a dark suit that probably cost more than his judgment was worth, my mother in something appropriately expensive, Daniel with the casual confidence of someone who believed he belonged everywhere. They scanned the room looking for familiar faces, for opportunities, for whatever it was they had come to find. They did not notice me immediately. I was standing with a group of colleagues involved in a conversation about market trends occupying a space in the room that they would not have thought to look at. When my mother finally spotted me, she waved with the enthusiasm of someone performing recognition rather than feeling it. I excused myself from my conversation and walked toward them. My father greeted me with a nod, my brother, with something that might have been a smile, my mother, with the kind of embrace that ended before it really began. They asked how I was, what I was doing there, whether I had come with someone. I answered vaguely, deflecting their questions with questions of my own. I asked about their trip, about their accommodations, about whatever my brother was working on these days. The conversation was familiar, following patterns established over decades. They talked, I listened, they assumed I allowed. The dynamic had not changed even here, in a room where everything was about to change. As we talked, I noticed people approaching our group. People who wanted to speak with me, who recognized me from the program or from the industry. They introduced themselves, made small talk, and expressed anticipation for the evening's honors. My family watched these interactions with something like confusion, unable to square what they were seeing with what they believed they knew. The gala began, and we took our seats. My family sat together at a table near the back, guests of someone else included but not central. I sat at the front at a table reserved for the evening's honorees, visible but not explained. The program proceeded through its early segments, speeches, and recognitions, building toward the evening's major announcements. I listened with half my attention, the other half occupied by the awareness of my family's presence, by the approaching moment when everything would become clear. Richard took the stage to introduce the final honor of the evening. He spoke about innovation, about leadership, about the qualities that distinguished the person he was about to recognize. He spoke about building something from nothing, about perseverance and vision. He did not look at me yet. He was building towards something, creating a context for what he was about to reveal. And in that suspended moment, I felt the weight of everything that had led here, every dismissal and every doubt, every quiet morning of work, and every difficult decision. It had all brought me to this room, to this moment, to the breath before the truth emerged. The ballroom was designed to communicate importance. Everything about it, from the height of the ceilings to the quality of the crystal chandeliers, proclaimed that this was a space where significant things happened. The people gathered here understood this, instinctively carried themselves with the self-awareness of those who knew they were being watched. I had been in rooms like this many times, but tonight felt different. Tonight I was not simply attending. I was at the center of something about to happen, though no one at my family's table understood this yet. From my seat near the stage, I could see them clearly. My father was leaning toward the man next to him, talking with the animated authority he deployed in social situations. My mother was smiling at something someone had said, her practiced charm seamlessly activated. Daniel was looking at his phone, performing boredom, the way he had learned to perform everything. They did not look in my direction. I was seated too far away at a table they had not examined closely, among people they did not know. Their assumption that I was somewhere in the back of the room, as peripheral here as I had always been in their lives, remained intact. The evening proceeded through its scheduled elements. Speeches were delivered, awards were presented, applause rose and fell in predictable waves. I participated in the conversations at my table, smiled at the appropriate moments, and consumed very little of the excellent food. My stomach was too unsettled for eating, though not from nervousness. It was anticipation, the body's recognition that something significant was approaching. Richard caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small nod. We had discussed this moment, what he would say and how he would say it. He understood the personal stakes for me, though I had tried to minimize them in our conversations. He was a perceptive man, and he had seen enough of my family to draw his own conclusions. The program moved toward its finale. The master of ceremonies announced the final recognition of the evening, the honor for distinguished leadership and innovation. Richard rose from his seat and walked to the podium with the deliberate pace of someone who knew how to command attention. He began with general remarks about the industry, about the changes that had transformed financial services over the past decade, about the kinds of leadership that had made those changes possible. His voice was calm and authoritative, carrying easily through the room's excellent acoustics. I watched my family as Richard spoke. My father had stopped talking, his attention captured by the mention of significant industry figures. My mother had composed her face into an expression of polite interest. Daniel had put away his phone. Richard began to describe the person he was honoring. He spoke about analytical brilliance, about the ability to see opportunities where others saw only risk. He spoke about operational discipline, about building systems that could scale without losing integrity. He spoke about quiet determination, about years of work conducted without fanfare or self-promotion. And he spoke of integrity, the quality that underpins every successful venture. I saw my father nod approvingly at these descriptions, appreciating the qualities being honored, without connecting them to anyone he knew. Richard spoke about the company we had built together, though he did not name it yet. He described its origins, its growth, its impact on the small businesses it served. He spoke about the principles that guided our decisions, about the culture we had created, about the team that had made everything possible. My brother leaned over and said something to my mother. I could not hear the words, but I could guess the content, wondering who this paragon was, perhaps speculating about connections that could be made. Richard paused. The room was fully attentive now, everyone waiting for the name that would complete the picture he had been painting. That was when my father made his joke. He leaned toward his table companion, probably intending to make a private comment, but his voice carried farther than he expected in the quiet room. "Well," he said, "let's hope this isn't another family beggar type." The people at his table laughed the tight laughter of those who feel obligated to appreciate a powerful man's humor. My brother added something about never being related to someone like that, his voice cold and casual. My mother said nothing. She looked down at her plate, the same avoidance she had practiced throughout my childhood. The words reached me clearly, cutting through the room's anticipation. I felt the familiar weight of them, the practiced dismissal that had shaped so much of my life. But this time, the weight landed differently. This time, I knew what was coming next. Richard had heard, too. I saw his expression flicker, saw him process what had just happened, and decide in that instant to continue exactly as planned. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice slightly louder than before, "before we continue, there's something you need to understand about the person I'm honoring tonight." The room went very quiet. Even the ambient noise of 300 people seemed to suspend itself. Richard looked directly at my family's table, then at me, then back at the assembled crowd. "The woman I'm about to recognize has built something extraordinary through her own vision, her own discipline, and her own determination. She has never sought recognition. She has never demanded acknowledgement. She has simply done the work year after year, decision after decision, until the work itself became impossible to ignore." I rose from my seat and walked toward the stage. The movement drew every eye in the room, including those of my family. I watched their faces as recognition began to dawn, as they connected the woman walking forward with the daughter and sister they had dismissed for 3 decades. My father's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. My mother's hand rose to her throat in a gesture that might have been surprising, or might have been something else entirely. Daniel's face went through a series of emotions too quickly to catalog. Richard extended his hand to help me onto the stage. I took it, steadied myself, and turned to face the room. "Allow me to introduce," Richard said, "the Forbes-honored founder and majority owner of this institution. My partner, my colleague, and one of the finest financial minds I have ever known. Amelia." The applause began, but I barely heard it. I was watching my family's table, watching the moment when the story they had believed about me collapsed into irrelevance. The applause continued, but time had fractured into something strange and elastic. I stood on the stage beside Richard, looking out at a room full of faces. but the only faces I truly saw were the three at that table near the back, the three who had spent my entire life teaching me that I was less than, smaller than, other than. My father's expression had frozen into something unreadable. He was a man who prided himself on composure, on never being caught without the right word or the appropriate response. But Richard's announcement had stripped that composure away, leaving behind a blankness that might have been confusion or might have been the beginning of understanding. My mother's hand was still at her throat. She looked at me the way you might look at a stranger who suddenly revealed themselves to be someone you once knew, someone you had forgotten or never quite noticed. There was recognition in her eyes, but it was fighting against something else, something that looked almost like grief. Daniel had recovered more quickly than either of them, his face arranging itself into an expression I knew well. It was the expression he wore when reality contradicted his assumptions, a kind of dismissive skepticism that allowed him to reject what he was seeing rather than adjust his understanding. I did not speak immediately. The moment was too significant to rush, too weighted with years of silence to fill with hasty words. I let the applause continue, let the room's attention settle around me like a garment, let the truth of my presence on that stage become undeniable. Richard stepped back, giving me the podium and everything it represented. His role was finished. What happened next was mine alone. I had prepared remarks, of course. I had written careful words about innovation and partnership, about the importance of serving underrepresented communities, about the principles that had guided our work. But standing there looking at my family, I understood that those prepared words were insufficient. I spoke instead from something deeper, something I had been carrying for 30 years. I learned early in my life, I began my voice steady in a way that surprised me, that worth is not always recognized by those closest to us. I learned that families can love us and still fail to see us, can provide for us materially while starving us in other ways. The room was absolutely silent. I was not following the expected script for an acceptance speech, and everyone sensed that something more personal was happening. I built this company, I continued, not to prove anything to anyone. I built it because I saw a need and believed I could address it. I built it because the work was meaningful and the challenge was worthy. I built it because I wanted to create something that was mine, something that could not be given or taken away by the opinions of others. I did not look directly at my family's table. I did not need to. I knew they were hearing every word, understanding every implication. But I would be lying if I said the dismissals of my past had no effect on me. I would be lying if I said I never wondered whether the people who should have believed in me were right, whether I was truly as insignificant as they seemed to think. The admission hung in the air, more vulnerable than anything I had ever said publicly. What I learned is that other people's assessments are not the truth. They are opinions shaped by their own limitations and biases, their own fears and failures. The truth is what you build. The truth is what you do when no one is watching, when no one is applauding, when the only recognition comes from your own knowledge that you have done something well. I paused, gathering myself for what came next. Tonight I accept this honor with gratitude and with humility. I accept it on behalf of everyone who has been dismissed by those who should have supported them, everyone who has been underestimated by those who should have recognized their potential. I accept it as evidence that the stories others tell about us do not have to define our lives. The applause that followed was different from before. It was deeper, more sustained, carrying an emotional weight that transcended the usual polite appreciation. People were standing now throughout the room, responding to something they had felt in my words. I looked at my family's table for the first time since I began speaking. They were not standing. My father remained seated, his face still locked in that unreadable expression. My mother had tears in her eyes, though whether they were tears of pride or tears of something else I could not tell. Daniel was looking at his phone again, refusing to engage with what was happening. I stepped away from the podium and let the evening continue. There were hands to shake congratulations, to accept conversations that required my attention. The machinery of professional recognition demanded its due, and I gave it, moving through the room with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to perform competence even when her heart was elsewhere. Through it all, I was aware of my family's presence, aware of the shift that had occurred in the room's power dynamics. People who had been eager to speak with my father earlier now glanced at him differently, recalculating his significance in light of what they had learned about his daughter. Colleagues who had ignored my existence now sought me out, asking questions, making connections, treating me as someone who mattered. My father made no move to approach me. He remained at his table, surrounded by people who no longer saw him as the most important person in his family. Whether this was pride or shame or simple confusion, I did not know. My mother approached, eventually moving through the crowd with the careful steps of someone unsure of her welcome. She reached me during a pause between conversations and stood there looking at me with an expression I had never seen before. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, her voice quiet enough that only I could hear. The question contained so much that I almost laughed. Why didn't I tell them? Why didn't they ask? Why didn't they notice? Why didn't they care enough to pay attention to who I was becoming? "You never asked," I said. "You never asked about my work, my life, my achievements. You assumed you already knew who I was, and you stopped looking long before I became this." She did not argue. She could not argue. The truth of what I said was too obvious, the evidence of their neglect too clearly displayed by their shock at this evening's revelation. "I'm proud of you," she said finally, and the words landed on me like stones, heavy and unwelcome. "I know you mean that," I said, "but I needed to hear it 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when it would have meant something. Now it's just information. Now it doesn't change anything." She looked at me with something that might have been understanding, and then she walked away, back to her husband and son, back to the family unit that had never quite included me. The remainder of the gala passed in a kind of haze. I performed the role expected of me, accepting congratulations and engaging in conversations, but my attention was divided between the present moment and the larger reckoning that I knew was only beginning. My father did not speak to me that night. He remained at his table until it was socially acceptable to leave, then departed with my mother and brother without attempting to approach me. I watched them go, their exit, unremarkable three people leaving an event where they had discovered they were less significant than they had believed. I stayed until the end, fulfilling my obligations as an honoree. Richard found me during a quiet moment and asked if I was all right. I told him I was, which was not entirely true, but was true enough. I was processing, integrating, trying to understand what had changed and what remained the same. What had changed was external. The room now knew who I was, what I had built, the position I occupied in the industry. People who had overlooked me would not overlook me again. Professional recognition had been publicly confirmed. What remained the same was internal. I was still the person I had always been, the person who had built something valuable through discipline and determination. The recognition did not make me more capable or more worthy than I had been that morning. It simply made my capability visible to people who had chosen not to see it before. I returned to my hotel room late that night and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about what had happened and what would happen next. My family would have to respond somehow. They would have to integrate this new information into their understanding of who I was, would have to reconcile the daughter and sister they had dismissed with the founder and leader who had been honored before their eyes. I did not know how they would manage this reconciliation, whether they would admit their failures or find new ways to explain them away. I suspected the latter. People are remarkably creative in protecting their self-image and constructing narratives that excuse their behavior and preserve their sense of themselves as good and reasonable. My family had spent decades building a story in which I was insignificant, and one evening's revelation was unlikely to demolish that story entirely. The next morning I received a text from my mother asking if we could meet for coffee before I left Hartford. I agreed more out of curiosity than hope. We met at a cafe near my hotel, a neutral space where neither of us had advantage. She ordered tea. I ordered coffee. We sat across from each other like strangers, which in many ways we were. She began with apologies which I had expected. She was sorry they had not known about my success, sorry they had not been more supportive, sorry for the years of oversight and neglect. The apologies were sincere, I believed, but they were also incomplete. She was sorry for the outcomes without fully reckoning with the causes. I listened without interrupting, letting her say what she needed to say. When she finished, I asked her a question that had been forming in my mind since the gala. What was it about me that made it so easy to overlook? She looked startled by the question, unprepared for its directness. She started to offer a response, then stopped, reconsidered, tried again. "You were always so capable," she said finally. "You never seemed to need anything from us. You handled everything yourself, managed your own life, never asked for help or attention. It was easy to assume you were fine." The answer was illuminating in ways she probably did not intend. She was describing a survival strategy as if it were a personality trait, interpreting my adaptation to their neglect as the cause of that neglect. I had learned to manage without their support because their support was not available, and she was using that adaptation to excuse the original failure. "I needed attention," I said. "I just learned not to ask for it because asking never worked." She absorbed this without visible reaction, her face maintaining the pleasant neutrality she had perfected over years of avoiding conflict. I could see her processing my words, fitting them into whatever framework allowed her to continue believing she had done her best. "Your father wants to talk to you," she said, changing the subject with practiced skill. "He's struggling with all of this, but he wants to understand." I considered this offer. My father wanting to talk was unprecedented, a break from decades of unilateral communication in which he spoke and I listened. Perhaps he was genuinely ready to reckon with his behavior. Perhaps he was simply looking for a way to reassert control over a situation that had escaped his management. "He can call me," I said, "but I'm not going to pretend that one conversation can undo 30 years. I'm not going to make this easy for any of you." She nodded, accepting this condition, or perhaps simply acknowledging that she had heard it. We finished our drinks in something approaching comfortable silence, two women who shared blood, but little else trying to find a new way to occupy the same space. Before we parted, she asked if I was happy. The question surprised me with its simplicity, its apparent concern for something beyond social performance. "I'm building something meaningful," I said. "I'm surrounded by people who respect my work and value my contributions. I have autonomy and purpose and the satisfaction of doing difficult things well. Whether that's happiness, I'm not sure, but it's enough." She hugged me, then a real embrace, rather than the perfunctory contacts we usually exchanged. I let her hold on for a moment longer than necessary, feeling the complicated weight of a mother's arms around a daughter she had only recently begun to see. Then I walked away back to the life I had built, leaving her to find her way back to the family that would now have to reconfigure itself around a truth they had ignored for far too long. The weeks following the gala brought changes I had anticipated, and changes that surprised me. The anticipated changes were professional new partnership inquiries, speaking invitations, media requests, the inevitable attention that follows public recognition. I managed these through our communications team, accepting some opportunities and declining others based on strategic value rather than personal preference. The surprising changes were personal, specifically the ways my family attempted to rebuild connection after decades of neglect. My father called as my mother had predicted. The conversation was awkward and halting, two people trying to communicate across a distance that had grown too large for casual bridging. He asked about the company, about my work, about the details of a life he had never bothered to learn. I answered his questions with the same brevity I had always used with him, providing information without elaboration. He did not apologize directly. That was not his way. Instead, he expressed something that might have been admiration mixed with something that might have been regret. He said he had underestimated me, which was the closest he could come to admitting he had been wrong. He said he wanted to do better, which was a promise that carried no specific commitment. I told him I appreciated the call. I did not tell him it changed anything, because it did not. Words spoken after 30 years of contrary action are just words. They carry no weight against the accumulated evidence of behavior. Daniel called too, which surprised me more than our father's call. He had always been comfortable in his role as the favored child, secure in his position at the center of our family's attention. The revelation at the gala had disrupted that security, and I could hear in his voice the disorientation of someone whose map no longer matched the territory. He asked if we could meet just the two of us to talk. I agreed partly because I was curious about what he would say, and partly because refusing would have required energy I preferred to spend elsewhere. We met at a restaurant in Boston neutral territory for both of us. He was already seated when I arrived, looking older than I remembered the confidence I had always associated with him seeming thinner, more fragile. He started by congratulating me on the recognition which felt performative, but was probably sincere. Then he asked questions about the company, about how I had built it, about the decisions that had shaped its growth. His questions were intelligent, more intelligent than I had expected, and I found myself providing more detailed answers than I had planned. Eventually, he asked the question I had been waiting for. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I considered various responses. I could have been kind, could have softened the truth into something easier to hear. But Daniel had spent our entire lives benefiting from softened truths, and I decided he deserved the unfiltered version. "Because you never asked," I said. "Because every time I tried to share something about my life, you changed the subject or looked at your phone or made it clear that my accomplishments were not interesting to you. Because I learned early that I was not important enough for your attention, and I stopped trying to earn something that should have been given freely." He received this without visible defensiveness, which surprised me. I had expected him to argue, to explain, to defend himself the way he had always defended himself. Instead, he sat with my words, letting them land. "I was a terrible brother," he said finally. "Yes," I agreed. "You were. I don't know how to fix that." "You probably can't. Some things once broken don't repair. The best you can do is not break them further." He nodded, accepting this assessment, with more grace than I had anticipated. Perhaps the years had changed him more than I realized. Perhaps the gala had forced a reckoning he had needed, but never sought. We talked for another hour, the conversation gradually shifting from the weight of our history to lighter topics. He told me about his current work, a consulting business that was modest but stable. He had learned, he said, that he was not cut out for the entrepreneurial risks he had once attempted. He was better suited to supporting others' visions than creating his own. This admission represented a kind of growth I had not expected from him. The Daniel I remembered would never have acknowledged his own limitations, would have reframed every failure as a strategic choice. This Daniel seemed more realistic, more grounded, more aware of who he actually was, rather than who he had been told he could be. We parted with something that felt almost like warmth, though I was careful not to mistake a single good conversation for a transformed relationship. The patterns of 30 years would not dissolve overnight. But it was a beginning, the first authentic exchange I could remember having with my brother. In the following months, I maintained contact with my family in ways I had not done before. Not frequent contact, not intimate contact, but more than the minimal engagement that had characterized our relationship for years. I spoke with my mother, occasionally exchanged messages with Daniel, accepted invitations to holiday gatherings that I had previously declined. The gatherings themselves were different now. I was no longer invisible, no longer talked around and through. My opinions were solicited, my contributions acknowledged. The family dynamic had shifted, though. Whether this was genuine change or performance remained unclear. I did not fully trust the transformation. Too many years of contrary evidence made trust difficult, but I was willing to observe, to test, to see whether their altered behavior would persist or eventually revert to familiar patterns. What I noticed most was not their changed treatment of me, but my own changed relationship to their treatment. I no longer needed their recognition. The years of building something independent had freed me from that need. Their acknowledgement was pleasant but not essential, appreciated but not required. This freedom was the most valuable thing I had gained from the entire experience. Not the company, not the recognition, not the vindication at the gala. The freedom to define my own worth independent of their assessment. The freedom to choose connection without desperation, to accept relationships without dependency. I had arrived somewhere finally. not at triumph, not at revenge, but at a kind of peace that had nothing to do with their opinions and everything to do with my own understanding of who I had become. I did not win anything that night at the gala. Winning implies a contest, and I had stopped competing with my family's expectations years before the revelation that finally made my success visible to them. What happened in that ballroom was not victory. It was simply truth finally spoken aloud in a space where it could not be ignored. The months since that night have been full of the ordinary work of continuing to build. The company grows, faces, challenges, adapts, grows again. The cycle of business does not pause for personal revelations, and I would not want it to. The work is what matters, has always been what matters. The recognition was a moment. The work is a lifetime. I think often about what family means and what it should mean. I grew up believing that family was the people you were born to, the people who shared your blood and your name and your history. I believed that belonging to them was automatic, that their love was guaranteed even when their attention was not. I no longer believe this. Family, I have come to understand, is not simply a matter of genetics. It is a choice renewed constantly through action. It is the people who see you and value you, who show up when showing up is difficult, who invest in your flourishing without expecting return. By this definition, my biological family had failed me for decades, while the family I built at work, the colleagues who trusted me, and the partners who supported me had succeeded beyond anything I had known before. This does not mean I have abandoned my parents and brother. The connections of blood carry their own weight, their own obligations. I maintain those connections, participate in the rituals of family, and show up for the occasions that require my presence. But I no longer seek from them what they cannot provide. I no longer measure my worth by their acknowledgement or their absence of acknowledgement. My father has not fundamentally changed. He is still the man who used words as weapons, who distributed attention according to calculations. I never understood who built a hierarchy in our family, with himself at the top and me at the bottom. The gala shook that hierarchy, but did not demolish it. He has found ways to incorporate my success into his self-narrative ways that minimize his own failures and maximize his genetic contribution to my achievements. This is what people do. This is what he has always done. My mother remains who she has always been, a woman who chose peace over justice and cannot quite understand why that choice had costs. She is proud of me now, she says, and I believe her, but her pride carries the asterisk of its lateness, the qualification of its conditions. She is proud of me because I have become someone impressive. She was not proud of me when I was simply her daughter, working hard and growing quietly, seeking a recognition she did not think to offer. Daniel has surprised me most. The brother who dismissed me so casually at the gala has become someone more thoughtful, more humble, more aware of his own limitations. Whether this change is permanent remains to be seen, but I have allowed myself to hope that the person he is becoming might be someone worth knowing. I do not regret the years of invisibility. They taught me things that recognition never could have. They taught me self-reliance, the understanding that my worth does not depend on witnesses. They taught me discipline, the ability to work without applause, because the work itself was enough. They taught me discernment, the capacity to distinguish between people who see me and people who see only what they expect to see. These lessons have made me who I am. They have shaped the leader I have become, the decisions I make, the culture I have built in the company I helped create. I could not have learned them in a family that celebrated me. I learned them in a family that overlooked me, and that learning, painful as it was, has been its own kind of gift. To the women listening to this story, and I know you are listening, I want to say something that I wish someone had said to me 30 years ago. Your worth is not determined by the people who fail to see it. Their blindness is not your limitation. Build anyway. Grow anyway. Become who you are meant to be, regardless of who does or does not applaud. The stage they deny you is not the only stage that exists. You can build your own stage, your own audience, your own definition of success. It is harder that way, lonelier in the beginning, more uncertain in the middle. But what you build yourself cannot be taken from you. What you earn through your own effort belongs to you in a way that inherited recognition never could. I was called the family beggar by a man who did not understand that I had stopped seeking anything from him years before he made that joke. I was dismissed by a brother who did not realize that his opinion had become irrelevant to my sense of myself. I was overlooked by a mother who did not grasp that I had already found the recognition I needed from people who actually paid attention. None of them could see what was coming. None of them understood who I had become. Their blindness was complete, and their shock at the revelation was proportional to that blindness. But here is what I want you to understand the lesson beneath all the other lessons of this story. I did not reveal my success to prove them wrong. I did not seek that moment at the gala to achieve revenge. The revelation happened because truth eventually emerges, because reality eventually asserts itself, because you cannot hide substance forever behind the veil of other people's assumptions. I built something real. I became someone capable. I created value that exists independent of my family's acknowledgement. And when the moment came for that reality to become visible, I was not vindicated. I was simply recognized for what I had already been for years. The family beggar owns the bank now, not because she won anything, but because she built her own truth.